we're going to talk about Bitcoin, which is a decentralized currency. It's created by, nobody's really sure who created it. It's a mysterious person or persons, and you've probably read a lot about it in the news. Is Canada going to tax it? PayPal may use it. You may have heard about the two Bitcoins exchanges sort of fighting over stuff. They're talking about suing each other. So we're going to talk about, does currency have to be paper? And who has to control currency? Does the government have to control currency? Raises a lot of these questions. Is it a new currency for the information age? So to talk to us about that, it's going to be Gabe Stein, who's a former Google developer and an entrepreneurial journalist. He works at Fastco Labs, Verticals. He's a bit of a disruptor himself because he's created a lot of his own journalist things from middle school through college, and in fact in high school got suspended for handing out opt-out forms to try to get everybody in his school to opt out of the No Child Left Behind testing. Would have given his school a 0. They didn't appreciate this, so they suspended him. So he's a bit of a renegade, and he's interested in Bitcoin. He says it forces us to examine what currency is, how powers and governments control it, and whether they should. And all these sort of issues come up. And here's Gabe to tell us all about it.
Thanks very much, Deirdre. I got it erased from my permanent record, so just so it's clear, so that didn't harm me too much. But I do like the fact that I was suspended for journalism. That makes it feel like real, right? Anyhow, so I want to give a really quick overview about what Bitcoin is first, because a lot of people are reading about it and hear about this virtual currency but don't actually understand necessarily what that means. So we know that it was invented or released, if you want to say, in 2009 by a developer, or possibly a group of developers who go by the pseudonym Satoshi Nakamoto. And it was released in 2009, and the timing kind of corresponds with when we started to realize that we were in a very deep fiscal crisis. And we actually know that it was created in response to the fiscal crisis, and I'll talk about how we know that in a second, because it's really interesting that the reason why we know that these people actually intended it that way. So the basic idea behind Bitcoin is to decentralize currency. Every single currency in the world, pretty much, except for informal ones, every single formal currency is centralized. It's backed by some central authority figure, usually a government, right? And so the thinking behind this was, well, governments mess things up a lot, as we saw with the fiscal crisis. So is there a way where we can take them completely out of it and sort of base our valuation of currency, of money, on something else? And there are three really interesting ways that Bitcoin attempts to do this. The first thing is, one of the problems with normal currencies, obviously, is the central bank. They're the ones who kind of guarantee that the money has value. And so you have to trust in them. And there are a lot of people who don't like trusting government. I don't have to tell you that. So the central idea behind this is, can we replace that trust in central banks to back up the value of the currency with trust in mathematics, with trust in cryptographic proof of work, is what they call it. And so that's one of the core concepts, is it better to trust mathematics than it is people? Another thing they're trying to do is, one of the problems with digital currency and with transferring currencies online is that identity is a real problem, right? You have to know that the person spending this is the real person, because if they're not and you have fraud, someone's going to lose money. And so to deal with this, we have trusted third parties like PayPal, banks, credit card processors, these kinds of people who verify that these payments go through, and we have to place our trust in them, and that can be very dangerous. PayPal is notorious for basically not providing people with the fraud protection that they say they're going to, and so a lot of people don't like this idea. And there's a third thing that Bitcoin's trying to do, and that's solve what's called the double spend problem. This is a classic problem that digital currencies have all the time, which is that because these digital bits move in real time, but then have to be backed up in a much slower way by these banks, it takes about 24 hours, right, for a transaction to go through. There are lots of cases where people try to defraud the system by spending the same digital money twice. And Bitcoin has a really interesting way of dealing with this problem. So how does it exactly solve these three things? It's very complicated. I don't pretend to understand everything that happens behind the scenes, because there's a lot of, you have to really know your cryptography, and I don't, frankly, but I'm going to give a little bit of a description of how it works. The first thing is transacting money. Transacting money uses something called asymmetric key cryptography. Basically, the upshot of this is it means that when you create a Bitcoin wallet to store money, and when you want to send a transaction, it generates a public key and a private key. The public key gets sent out to everybody in the network, along with the currency that you want to exchange and who you want to send it to, someone else's public key in this case. And then you can sign that transaction with your private key, and the idea is only you know the private key, and only you can create the signature, but then other people can use a different algorithm to put the public key and the signature together and say, yes, this did come from the right person. But they can't use that to create your private key. That's why it's called asymmetric. So that's kind of how transactions work. But there's an important quirk in the Bitcoin system that becomes important later, which is that you don't actually need to sign these transactions to have them go through. All you have to post is a valid piece of Bitcoin and the receiver's address that you want it to go to. And if you don't sign it, it means anybody can spend it, and essentially the currency is destroyed. This creates something really interesting later on. So we talked earlier about avoiding the double spend problem then, right? Because if it's really easy to send these transactions, then theoretically a malicious person, an attacker, could say, I'm going to send this currency to Bob, and I'm also going to send this currency to Jill at the same time, the same exact one. And because there's no central authority who says, you know, okay, Bob already sent it, or I already sent it to Bob, you can't send it to Jill again, right? This could be a real problem. So how does Bitcoin solve that? Well, what they came up with is this process of verifying transactions. And what you do is you send the transaction to the network, the entire network looks at this, and then they have to do this really difficult math in order to verify that the transaction goes through. And there's a race to basically be the first person to say, yes, all of these transactions are valid, and so therefore the entire network should accept it, right? This has been made very difficult by a bunch of sort of tools of cryptography, and the idea being that it takes a lot of computing power, and it takes a lot of, therefore, electricity, and therefore a lot of capital, a lot of money to verify these transactions, right? But that's not a great model, because why would I be willing to spend a lot of money and a lot of electricity to verify these transactions, right? What's in it for me? Well, in the real world, these payment processors who verify transactions, they get transaction fees, right? But in this Bitcoin world, because everybody's racing to solve these problems, one transaction fee isn't going to be enough. There needs to be a bigger reward. And so what they've done is they've said, okay, as a reward for verifying these transactions, the first person who does it gets 25 new Bitcoin for free, right? That's your reward for doing this. And so in that way, you create an incentive for people to act as the verifiers, for everybody to act as the PayPal or the banks in this system. And so in this way, there's also another thing here, which is it solves that double spend problem, because you have to verify these transactions first. And if an attacker wanted to spend the same amount of coin twice, they'd have to spend it and then do this computation twice and prove that they had done it twice faster than the entire rest of the network combined, right? And so in this way, it's actually more profitable, if you think about it, for an attacker to just play by the rules and possibly get that 25 new Bitcoin than it is to spend all of this money and all of this electricity trying to fake out the entire rest of the system. And it's been around for 2.5 years now, 3 years. And this has worked remarkably well. So that's kind of a basic overview of how things work. Now, there's one interesting quirk in here, which is that the difficulty of verifying these transactions is designed to increase such that a new block, they call them, it's called a block of 25 Bitcoins is created once every 10 minutes. And that's all of the monetary policy there is. There's no central bank. There's no government saying we're going to issue new money because we're worried about deflation or whatever. So as a result of this, there's always going to be more demand for currency than there is supply, because the supply is very predictable. This means that Bitcoin is deflationary by nature, which is the exact opposite of how most currencies work, where they try to maintain a small amount of inflation over time. This has had a lot of consequences on the system that I'm going to get into in a second. So that's the overview of how it works. And now I think there's a lot more interesting stuff to talk about than just the system. The real question that people are grappling with is this actually money? Is this actually currency? And that's actually a really difficult question to answer. Deirdre mentioned in her introduction to this talk that economics textbooks define money as three things. They have to be a medium of exchange, meaning, can you buy things with them, essentially. They have to be a store of value, meaning you have to reliably trust that if you put money in, you're going to be able to get at least something out later. And they have to be a unit of account. How does Bitcoin rank on these three things? It's a pretty good medium of exchange, actually. You can't buy everything in Bitcoin, but it turns out you can buy a lot. You can buy love because OkCupid has started accepting it. You can buy electronics. You can buy, you can buy a lot of different things with it. So it functions pretty well in that way. What about as a store of value? Bitcoin is notoriously unstable. It fluctuates $50, $60 a day. But it's actually still, and especially in the last 15 or 20 days or so since the last crash, it's been really, really stable. It's hovered around $100, $120 most of this time. So it actually does pretty well as a store of value, as kind of an alternate asset class to invest in, right, if you're an investor. So the third thing, is it a unit of account? That just means when you walk into a store and you see a price, is it in Bitcoin? And if it's in Bitcoin, do you have to translate it to dollars in your head, or can you just say, yes, I know what that's worth in Bitcoin? And the answer to that is really interesting. The most common usage of Bitcoin is actually to buy drugs on a website called Silk Road through this anonymous network called Tor. And on this site, it displays prices in Bitcoins, and it displays prices in dollars at the same time. So you can kind of do the math. And also the prices in Bitcoin are pegged to the dollar. So they fluctuate kind of in real time as the value of Bitcoin fluctuates. And this actually causes some really interesting questions, or really interesting problems for people. There was an electronics store that listed Bitcoin with 2 decimals, just like we list dollars, like 150, right, 1.50. When the value of Bitcoin went up, and it went dramatically up from $100 to $250 in the course of like a week, when it went up, everything on the electronics store was suddenly priced at 0.00 Bitcoin, because they didn't think about that. They didn't think about rounding. And so this is one of the problems with having a deflationary currency, is that as the value goes up, your prices drop, and you have to think about how to deal with that. And humans just aren't really good at dealing with decreasing prices. So that's a problem that it's caused. So anyhow, we can't say whether or not Bitcoin is currency. I really think, or is money rather. I really think that's the truth of the matter. And we won't know until we know if it stabilizes, until we get to a point where we're not sort of translating in our head. And I think there's some question about whether human beings can deal with values that go down rather than values that go up, right? I mean, a great example of why deflationary policy doesn't tend to work is, think about your salary, right? If the value of money goes up, the employer has to decrease your salary for it to stay the same, right? So imagine your employer saying, congratulations, we only decreased your salary by 1% this year instead of 2%. That's a raise. That's really difficult for humans to think of. So I don't know. I don't know if we can say if it'll ever actually happen as real currency. And there are some other issues with this as well. I talked about decentralization earlier. It turns out that because of the way it works, it might not actually always be decentralized. The way the system works, as I said, is that every transaction is stored and verified by everybody on the network. Well, think about how many transactions take place all the time every day. That's a ton of data. Right now it's about 7 gigabytes of data to download to your computer if you want to make a transaction. That's like a couple of days over the network because it's kind of slow. And so that's like really, that's not easy for us to do, is to like wait just to transact in this system, right? And that's only for a $2 billion economy. The world economy is $12 trillion, something like that, I think. When we get up there, this amount of hard drive space you're going to need to store this whole transaction history is going to be so large that like no individual is actually going to be able to do it. When no individual can do it, that means you're going to have these services in the cloud, right, who are going to store everything, and you're going to kind of connect to them and trust that they're going to keep your balance and do everything correctly. And if you have to trust someone, it's not really decentralized, is it? That person now just becomes a bank. There's another problem too, which is, I said it takes about 10 minutes to verify those transactions, or they try to be predictable so that every 10 minutes these transactions go through. That's a really long time. If you used a credit card today, you know it went through instantly, right? What's interesting is that transaction didn't go through instantly. It just looks like it. What happened was your bank floated a loan of credit to you basically and gave it to the person you purchased it from, and then 24 hours later they're going to tie the loose ends. Well, in order for Bitcoin to not take 10 minutes to make a transaction, you're going to have to do the same thing, right? And at the point you do that, that's just a third-party payment processor, right? The same thing as the current system. It really doesn't decrease the amount of trust you have to put into the system. So I don't know that we'll ever be able to say that Bitcoin will be a real will be a different currency, right? Even if it does become a real currency. And so in that case, what is it useful for, right? I think there are a couple of answers to that question, and I think that we're actually going to learn a lot from Bitcoin, even if it doesn't become a real currency, or even if it just basically becomes the same thing with a lot of centralized authorities you have to trust. One theory that I heard that was pretty good, there's a guy named Nicholas Colas who works for ConvergeX Group, which is sort of an analyst group, who floats this theory a lot, which is that Bitcoin is a new asset class, kind of like gold or silver, but not subject to the same kind of shocks. And so if you want to get out of your local currency and into something that nobody can really control in a centralized way, you can buy Bitcoin. And he theorizes, and I think I agree with him, that we saw this for the first time about 2 months ago when Cyprus had a credit crisis. And what happened in Cyprus was they closed down their banks, basically. They said you can't withdraw any currency from the country, or they put a very steep limit, like $100 on withdrawals. And as a result, we didn't see Cypriots investing in Bitcoin because they couldn't get their currency out. But what we did see, which was really interesting, was the Google search trends for searches in Bitcoin rose in Spain, in Italy, in France, in Germany, and other countries in the Eurozone that might have to face these issues in the future. So we think people are starting to see Bitcoin as an alternative to a gold or silver for sort of those hedging investments when they think that their government's going to do something stupid with their money. But the second theory, and I think this is by far the best one and the most interesting one, is that Bitcoin is a publishing system. I know that's kind of weird, but there's a quirk in Bitcoin that lets you embed messages in every transaction and every time those new Bitcoins are created. And I told you before that we know for a fact that Bitcoin was created as a response to the 2009 fiscal crisis. Well, how do we know this? I think I have it on here. Nope, I don't have it on there. I'll get to it in a second. How we know this is that the creator of Bitcoin, Satoshi Nakamoto, embedded a message in the original block of Bitcoin that said the date, I forget the exact date, but 2009, and had a headline from the Times of London saying, Chancellor approves second bailout for the banks. So he sent us a message when he created this, that this is the reason why he's creating it. And what's interesting is that other people are starting to do this as well. When Bitcoin was very new and it was pretty easy to mine, right? Because you didn't need a lot of computing power, the difficulty was low. A lot of individuals were mining Bitcoin. And there was one person who goes by the name of Luke Jr., who started what's called a mining pool, where a bunch of people put their computing power together, called Eligius. And he started embedding prayers and Bible verse every time he would mine a new block of Bitcoin. And now if you're thinking about the people who use the system being sort of like, pretty libertarian, distrustful of authority, they also tend to be a lot of atheists, and they didn't like this at all. So if you look at the sort of history of the first kind of couple years of Bitcoin, you actually see like basically a chat room argument going on between this Luke guy and a lot of the atheists here. And here's what that kind of looks like. You can see, prayers, and then someone saying, "I like turtles," and combo breaker, which I think is from Street Fighter. Is that what it's from? I don't know. It's from one of the fighting games. Someone calling Luke Jr. a pedophile, which happens a lot in anonymous internet forums, and then someone responding to the atheist with that link right there. And if you click on that, it's a Rickroll, right? So someone embedded a Rickroll inside of Bitcoin. So anyhow, there are some other interesting things that you can embed in this and that people are starting to embed. People have started to realize that there's a real value to embedding stuff in Bitcoin. What's the value? Well, it's probably the best digital archival system that has ever been invented, right? Think about it. If you send a message using Bitcoin, instantaneously hundreds of thousands of people are going to download and start distributing that message to hundreds of thousands of other people, someday millions, right? Because everybody stores the transaction history, every single person who uses it. That's better redundancy than any cloud storage system, better backup than literally any system on earth. And so if you want to send a message to someone that everybody needs to see, but that you want to be hard to trace, because it's pretty hard to trace Bitcoin transactions, this is a great way to do it, right? And people have started doing that. Someone started, a couple weeks ago actually, someone embedded a program, a Python programming language program for how to embed files in Bitcoin, so it could be a little self-replicating. And then a couple of weeks ago, someone used that same program to embed 2.5 megabytes of WikiLeaks documents. And, aha, you don't want a government to be able to delete the WikiLeaks cables, right? So what better way to store it than in this system that is highly redundant, that everybody has access to, that will probably never be deleted as long as the currency is there. Someone also stored some art in it that I thought was very cool. This is a tribute to someone named Len Sassaman, a developer, and also ASCII Bernanke. I just thought that was really funny to look at. But so they're storing all kinds of things in there. But there's actually a danger to this as well. And we start to see sort of the benefits of decentralization also become a danger, like the same things, right? About, I think it was 2 or 3 days ago, someone embedded a page from what's known as the Hidden Wiki. It's this site that lives behind this anonymous web browser called Tor. And it was a page containing links to child pornography, right? This is really dangerous for anybody who likes Bitcoin, because that means that this link got sent to everybody on the network, and everybody on the network making future transactions is going to send this essentially to other people, right? So people aren't worried that they're going to be arrested just for using Bitcoin, but what they are worried about is that governments will use this as an excuse to get warrants for computers that contain Bitcoin. They might know that you're doing something illegal but don't have enough evidence to get a warrant, and that they could then use this. And here's a really crazy thought to leave you with. The person who embedded this page is very savvy. It's not actually easy to embed these messages. They knew that was going to be exactly the effect of it. And so now, the decentralized nature, the ease with which Bitcoin spreads, its very popularity is becoming a huge danger for it. And I think that looking inside Bitcoin at this kind of literary history of the currency is how you're going to know whether or not it has a future or not. So that's what I got on Bitcoin. Thank you.
Thank you, Gabe. That's great. That's really interesting.